Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have the same cold that Richard did, so we'll see how I do here. Thank you all for coming. It's a great honor to be here. I'm Jeff Timberlake of the Department of Sociology. I'm an assistant professor in that department. I'd like to thank Richard and the whatever selection committee there was for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor. However, this word identity was a bit of a challenge for me. I'm a demographer by training and vocation, and I have to admit that the first thing I thought of when Richard asked me to speak on identity was the identity matrix. I'm listening for mathematicians in the audience. There they are. And now the identity matrix seems like it might be a kind of a juicy theoretical concept that you might use in postmodern literary critical analysis or something like that. But it's really just a matrix. It's square. It has ones on the diagonal and zeros off the diagonal. And it has a variety of really important applications in linear algebra, but well, I thought it would be hard to fill 15 minutes, frankly, on the identity matrix. So I'm going to do something else. I'm going to talk about the role of space in the formation and the consequences of ethnic identity. And the punchline is that I'm going to argue that ethnic identity is deeply spatial, and when I talk about space, I mean actual space territory on the earth, rooted to the ground, not a sort of a head space or something esoteric like that. And I'm going to argue that it affects two things. First, it affects the capacity of human beings to produce socially meaningful collectivities, groups. And second, that, and maybe even more importantly than the first, it affects the capacity or the distribution of resources and liabilities across those collectivities. So what I'm going to be arguing is that space acts either as a metaphorical kiln, which hardens boundaries around groups, or as a metaphorical crucible. Whoops, I have pictures of those. That's a kiln. Or as a metaphorical crucible, softening those boundaries. And so to do this, I'm going to show you a couple of distributions of fake populations in space. This is a fake city. It has three fake groups, reds, blues, and greens. I think those show up pretty well. And in this kind of city, imaginary city, if you lived in any of the neighborhoods in that city, a neighborhood, by the way, is supposed to be bound. It's a little 5x5 grid bounded in white up there. But any neighborhood that you lived in that city, you would live with members of all three groups, reds, blues, and greens. There's a 100% chance that you would share a neighborhood with members of all of these groups. And so to the extent that neighborhood identity becomes a part of individual identity, members of all these groups would belong to your identity. They would make sense. They would belong in your world. This city is what I'm calling a crucible. On the other hand, if we have a spatial organization of a city that looks like this, there's a couple of differences. First of all, there are literally boundaries around groups. There are spatial boundaries around them. Right? The reds live in some neighborhoods, the greens live in others, and the blues live in the rest. Okay? And that spatial difference becomes reinforced as social distance between groups. Because whereas in the first city, members of all of the groups belonged in your neighborhood, now, no matter what group you're in, we are not like them. Right? They live in different neighborhoods from where we live. Okay? So spatial difference gets converted into social distance. The second thing is, if you notice, if I do this, notice these little white squares here. Those are meant to indicate vacant houses. And notice that they cluster in the red and the green neighborhoods. Now we have not just a nominal difference between groups, but a socially meaningful characteristic that's different of the two groups. Right? So now if someone asked you to describe reds and greens, you might say, well, those are the neighborhoods where there's all the vacant houses, right? Those are the neighborhoods where the houses are run down, and if you know anything about vacant housing, those houses tend to become dilapidated. They tend to be targets for arson or squatting or use in the drug trade. So now what happens then is that spatial differences, neighborhood level differences, become reimagined as group differences. So when you describe the neighborhoods of reds and greens, you describe these scary vacant houses, and then someone asks to describe red and green people, and you say, well, I guess they're the kind of people who don't take care of their houses, and I guess they're the kind of people that are prone to violence and drug use. So again, social differences like that, spatial differences get reimagined as social differences, and that bakes on, in some sense, the meanings of group difference. That's what I'm calling a kiln city. Now, I also argued, let's see where I am here, that space acts on the distribution of resources and liabilities across groups. And so to do that, let's imagine these two cities side by side. We have city A and city B. Let's think of a couple of examples. The first is, suppose that political districts were drawn in a fairly simple fashion, in a kind of a grid. In city A, politicians from each district would have to represent members of all three groups relatively equally, right? There could be other kinds of differences across the districts, but at least in terms of color, ethnicity, red, green, and blue, there would be no differences. In city B, about half of the districts are primarily blue, and so to whatever extent blue politicians are able to get goodies for their districts, those will tend to flow towards blue neighborhoods, right? Blue politicians might not be ethnocentric in some sense. They're just doing what politicians ought to do. They're getting the goodies for their districts, but because of this spatial pattern, those goodies flow to particular kinds of neighborhoods and stay out of others. Or let's imagine that this imaginary city council is trying to debate about the siting of a garbage dump, or a commercial development, or a public housing project, or a baseball stadium. In the first city, no matter where those things are located, clearly the people who live around the garbage dump or the baseball stadium will experience different kinds of environments, but that won't be related to their color, right? In the kiln city, city B, usually it turns out that the group with the most political power wins the debate over where the siting of these things are. And so normally what happens is that the good stuff flows into the neighborhoods of the group with the most power, and the bad stuff flows into the neighborhood of the group that don't have so much power. And so not only does this have immediate effects on the environments of people who live around these things, but it also, again, is easy to see how people would say, well, I guess the green and red neighborhoods are the neighborhoods where the garbage dumps are and public housing projects, and the blue neighborhoods are the neighborhoods where the fun stuff is, the baseball stadiums and the commercial developments. And again, that gets reimagined as a characteristic of the group, not just the space. Or let's take a third example. Suppose the federal government is trying to decide where to invest or back scarce mortgage capital. And they decide that because of the lower poverty rates of blue neighborhoods, that those neighborhoods then become better credit risks. And the poverty rates are higher in the red and green neighborhoods, and so those become poorer credit risks. And so that ends up flowing capital into blue neighborhoods and keeping it out of red and green neighborhoods. And many of you may know this is precisely what happened during a crucial 30-year period from about 1935 to 1968, and even later for private mortgage capital. The federal government, principally the Federal Housing Administration, relied on so-called residential security maps to determine where to provide scarce capital. So here's a map of Philadelphia from 1937, and you can see that some of the neighborhoods are shaded in red, and either shading or outlining in red gives the practice of redlining its name. So let's take a look at this neighborhood here. I just sort of picked it at random. And let's figure out why it was denied FHA-backed loans. Well, it does have some advantage. This is, by the way, the actual actuary's score sheet for the neighborhood, or a piece of it. It has some advantages. It's close to business, close to transportation, has a lot of schools. But it was given the worst security grade, a D. Now, why would that be? Well, because it had some older housing, and also because there were a heavy concentration of so-called foreigners and some Negroes in the language of the time. Okay, so this neighborhood stood almost no chance of getting FHA-backed funding. It's important to remember two different things that are related. One is, those foreigners are mostly white. So this is not simply a case of the federal government acting in a sort of knee-jerk racist way. Secondly, and related to this, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment doesn't allow the federal government to treat people differently on the basis of race. And in fact, the FHA wasn't in this case. They were treating neighborhoods differently. They were deciding on the creditworthiness not of people, but of neighborhoods. But of course, when you have segregated cities like this, this has the effect then of funneling mortgage capital into white neighborhoods and keeping it out of black neighborhoods. And this had big effects on the suburbanization of the population after the post-war period. Here's just a quick example of this. In 1920, it may surprise you to know, that if you lived in a metropolitan area and you were black or white, you had about the same likelihood of living in a suburb. In the 3 decades that followed, the 4 decades really that followed, the white suburbanization rate of whites increased to over 50%, and the suburbanization rate of blacks dropped to 20%. Now, I think this is important for 2 reasons. First, in addition to the obvious massive government welfare program of the FHA policies for white people, and the massive level of disinvestment in the neighborhoods of African Americans and other racial and ethnic minorities, I think this had the effect of creating a kind of a stereotype of different groups, a social difference between the groups that made whites see themselves and be seen as sort of primordially suburban, and blacks and other minority groups as being kind of inveterately urban. And because these stereotypes are not real in a kind of an ontological sense, doesn't mean they're not socially real, right? As the British social anthropologist Richard Jenkins would say, just because ethnicity is imagined doesn't mean it's imaginary, right? Okay, so let me conclude with a few practical thoughts. I've argued that space not only reinforces group boundaries, but it also affects the distribution of goods and liabilities. And I think one thing to talk about in terms of what we can do about it is to say that there's a certain sense in which ethnicity is going to be fairly intransigent. There's not a real strong sense that ethnicity will just disappear as a thing that people know about or see or view themselves as. And I think this idea of the intransigence of race as a particular category of ethnicity is best expressed by that greatest of latter-day satirists, Stephen Colbert, who has a recurring bit on this subject. He says, "I don't see race. People tell me I'm white, and I believe them because," and then he has a variety of ways of filling in the blank. And I've culled a few from months of arduous late-night research for you today. The first is he says, "People tell me I'm white and I believe them because I belong to a whites-only country club." Or because police officers call me sir. Or because I'm scared of black people. And my personal favorite, people tell me I'm white and I believe them because I own a lot of Jimmy Buffett albums. So again, I don't think it's likely or even really desirable to sort of somehow try to erase ethnicity. I think it would be at best quixotic and at worst kind of counterproductive, because at least if we recognize ethnic differences, we can design social policies that might ameliorate the differences. And so there are a number of possibilities of these kinds of policies, but they all have to do with the idea of breaking the link between the fact of ethnicity and the consequence of ethnicity, or between what I'm calling nominal and consequential identity. And so there's a variety of ways we could do this. We can change hearts and minds. Clearly, over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a real effort to make people sort of more supportive of diversity and more recognize ethnic difference more, and I think that's all been terrific. I also think that clearly anti-discrimination policy is really important in housing and employment. But in keeping with the theme of my talk, I'm going to argue that another thing that we need to think more about is investing directly in communities. In other words, not trying to change people's minds and change people, but change communities where people live. There's some recent work by Rob Sampson, a sociologist, and his colleagues that show that even in very poor neighborhoods that have strong organizational bases, that can really deflect a lot of the problems that come from high levels of poverty relative to neighborhoods that are also poor but don't have those resources. And so I think that if we spend a little bit more time thinking about how we can invest directly in communities, this would have the benefit of both leveling the distribution of life chances in American communities, but also breaking the link between space and ethnic identity and outcome. Thank you.